Hello, Road to Now listeners. My name is Dr. Lewis Woods. I'm an associate professor and director of Africana Studies at Middle Tennessee State University. I've known Dr. Ben Sawyer for several years now, and a couple of weeks ago, he approached me with the idea of me potentially hosting a podcast on the racial and health crisis that we're experiencing in the country today. And I was initially a little reticent to accept the opportunity because I wasn't sure that I had enough to say myself. I don't have all the answers. And while I am an expert, I realized that this was bigger than me. And so part of what I wanted to do was to consult friends and colleagues about this moment, people who are smarter than me. And so I agreed to accept the invitation, and I think it's an excellent opportunity, right? The world is listening for sure. Let me first start by saying that this is not a bash on police. My grandfather was an NYPD, was a World War II veteran, and ended up, after coming home from the war, serving in the Navy, used the GI Bill partially to get a bachelor's degree in 1950, master's degree in 1952 from NYU. And the best job he could get in New York in the early 1950s as an African American was to become a police officer. So his partner had a high school diploma. He had a master's degree. And so my grandfather joined the force in 1953, moved up the ranks. By 1962, he got a second master's degree from City College. His thesis was essentially about the importance of a civilian complaint review board. And his argument was we need an apparatus to help police the police, right? Help the police become accountable to the way that they encounter communities, specifically vulnerable communities, communities of color, communities who are marginalized in a whole host of ways. And 58 years later, my grandfather's master's thesis is still so incredibly relevant. So I've always understood that police officers are people, right? They have loved ones they want to get home to, but they are also a byproduct of the society. And so I've always been able to appreciate, while I have my own fear and reticence of police, that police are people, right? And that they deserve our respect and appreciation. With that said, my grandfather, growing up, taught all of us, he gave us that talk about how to survive police encounters. And my grandfather talked about, in very great detail, and it was reinforced by my mother, ways to essentially survive the process. My grandfather said, if a police officer stops you on the street, pull all the contents of your pockets out so that they cannot plant anything on you. My grandfather talked about how if you're pulled over, you need to follow very specific instructions. Never keep your registration and insurance in the glove box, because he said if some police officers see you reaching over, they may see that as a threat. So keep it in the console under the armrest. By the time that you pull over, my grandfather would tell me to pull the window down, music off, have the registration, license, insurance in your left hand, conjure your most articulate voice, well-spoken, soft-spoken, hello, officer, what seems to be the problem, right? And essentially, don't make any sudden movements. And the fact that my grandfather had to articulate this to all of his kids and grandchildren, basically talking about ways to survive his engagement with his colleagues, to me says a lot. And so when I thought about doing a podcast on this current moment, I wanted us to at least have a conversation about and an acknowledgement about the difficult work and the humanity of police officers. Okay. What I wanted to do, because I didn't think that my research and my expertise had enough to cover the totality or the holistic nature of what we're experiencing, I wanted to consult many of my friends and colleagues. The first colleague that I invited was Dr. Tony Brown, who is a full professor at Rice University in sociology, who examines issues related to health disparities and how they relate to incarceration, wealth, and education. We talked to Terah Venzant Chambers, who is an expert in education and in inequalities in the educational system broadly. We talked to Sharita Jacobs-Thompson, who is an assistant professor and does an incredible class working with the DC Metro Police Department on the history of policing and the relationship with police to the broader Black community. I spoke with Dr. Michelle Stevens, who is a full professor in ed leadership and a trained counselor. She's done really excellent research on post-traumatic stress disorder as it pertains to trauma in the Black community in particular. And then in order to talk about the international aspect of the protests that have swept the country and the internationalism of the protest movement as well, I reached out to Dr. Glenn Chambers, who's a full professor of Latin American and Caribbean history. And so I wanted to bring these voices in because in order to understand what happened to George Floyd, you have to understand a whole host of stuff. Why communities of color live where they live, why they don't have the educational opportunities, why they're more susceptible, twice as likely to die of COVID-19 complications. To understand that we're going to have to figure out ways to reform police culture. And I think doing some of the work that Dr. Jacobs-Thompson does is really important in this process. And also, we have to understand that racism is global, and people of African ancestry the world over have been touched by the movement that's happening currently. And then finally, it made me think a little bit about how I'm excited that this movement is multiracial, is multi-ethnic, is national, and really international. And there's a part of me that's disheartened that it took this long. And even the language that George Floyd spoke, I can't breathe. I remember Eric Gardner saying the same thing in 2014. And this isn't the first time we've seen these videos, but why I think this time period may be different and why I think it's important to have a podcast on this is because the world had to essentially stop for a critical mass of white America to listen. All economic activity had to shut down. Everybody had to shelter in place all over the world. No distractions, no sports, no live TV, no celebrity gossip, not much commuting unless you're an essential employee. And so all you had to do was social distance a lot of times from your, work from home. If you had that kind of a job, watch your kids who were also without distractions as well and activities. And so most of us were on social media and watching TV during this whole time. And so it was impossible to turn away. And I think that's what made this moment different, or seems to make this moment a little bit different. And so, I'm excited about the conversation. I wanted to invite you guys to hear from people that I know and have talked to about these issues for more than a decade. These are my family and my friends and really, really smart people. And so come with me on this journey. Thanks. I have with me Dr. Tony Brown. He's a professor of sociology at Rice University, and his research looks at the intersectionality of health, wealth, incarceration, and education. First, Dr. Brown, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Woods. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
I'm excited to have a conversation about your research. I really wanted to reach out to you and have a conversation about some of this. Let me first start by asking how you're doing personally coping with the dual pandemics of racism and COVID.
I'm doing the best I can do, but honestly, the weight of the dual pandemics is overwhelming, and it feels like having some knowledge about the systemic nature of inequality makes it worse. I know what's happening and why it's happening, and it's overwhelming. And the truth is, watching people who look like me die disproportionately eats at your soul.
Mm-hmm.
This does not feel like a normal time, and I know that we need superhuman solutions. And when I look through and see the things I'm seeing happen in the world, honestly, I feel like I'm aging rapidly. In health, we talk about weathering and the degree to which Black people are weathered by racism. And I can tell you, when I saw that video of George Floyd in the midst of this pandemic, I aged considerably. I lost some parts of my life, and again, it ate away at my soul. So I'm trying to do the best I can, and hopefully I see a light, some glimmer of hope, and it's that people are willing to talk about these things. And so I appreciate you for giving us an opportunity to speak on this platform.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't have it any other way. So you talked a little bit about the disparities. What are some of the major factors that maybe make Black people and people of color more susceptible to maybe catching, but also more importantly, dying of COVID-19?
All right, so the one sentence answer is vulnerability created by the legacy and continued operation of white supremacy. So that's the one line. If you don't remember anything else, everything else I'm going to say will fit under the vulnerability created by the legacies and continuation of white supremacy. So when you break that down, you could look at any number of factors. So let's just take access to healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
So if we know preventative healthcare protects health, and Black people are more likely to be uninsured, more likely to not have a regular place to get healthcare, then that's going to contribute to disproportionate infections and death rates. And then there's another thing that relates to access, but it's much more complicated, is quality. So you could have access to healthcare, but if it's poorly organized, if your provider doesn't care about you, if your provider doesn't understand the social circumstances that are operative in your life, then you're not likely to get high quality care. There's studies that show, for instance, doctors differentially talk from white patients and Black patients. They're much more interested in getting questions from white patients than they are from Black patients. They will interrupt Black patients who are conveying medical information more often. And so to me, that means high quality of healthcare is not optimal. And then there's a range of things we might call social determinants of health. Some of them are housing. If you put people in crowded spaces with poor ventilation, there are studies that show, for instance, people who are dying from COVID have pre-existing kinds of conditions related to respiratory problems. Well, it turns out Black people are more likely to live near trash incinerators.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to have more problems. They're more likely to live near chemical plants. So they're going to have more respiratory problems. So when you think about the social determinants of health, pre-existing conditions like diabetes, that's just a function, again, of these vulnerabilities created by the legacies and the continuing significance of white supremacy. Because if you fed me chitlins, then ultimately you can't sit back and say, oh, wow, I'm surprised you have generations of poor health. If you've not put green vegetables in the supermarket, that overpriced supermarket in my neighborhood, you can't say, well, why don't you eat more vegetables?
Mm-hmm.
If I can't walk down the sidewalk and feel safe because I'm over-policed in some cases and under-policed in others, and crime is allowed to happen in my neighborhood because they're crimes of opportunity because people are desperate, then you can't tell me, well, you should get out and walk more.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all these things of social determinants of health that, again, are about systemic issues. And so one thing that I find disturbing when we talk about COVID-19 and its implications for the Black community, brown community, and we got to talk about American Indians too. The rate of infection among Navajo Indians is higher than it was in New York. And we've already marginalized them to the point that COVID-19 may finish the settler colonial project and destroy and decimate that whole population.
Good
So
Lord.
when we get to the point that we could talk about systemic kinds of things, then we can back off these kind of individual notions, because when it comes to health, I think we tend to individualize. If you're overweight, it's your choice. If you don't get your prescriptions, it's your choice. If you don't see a doctor regularly, it's your choice. But if you're overweight, well, we got to talk about access to food. We got to talk about access to exercise. We have to talk about time, right? And if you have to work 4 jobs to make ends meet, you don't have time. When we think about other kinds of systemic issues that are related to differential disability, differential death, differential mortality, it all comes down to structural forces that relate to the degree to which Black lives have never mattered. It struck me the other day. There was a time in American history, in U.S. history, when Black people were 3/5 of a person. And I reflected on that and realized, wow, that might have been the high point. We may never have been worth any more than that.
Wow.
And if you're not quite sure, all you have to do is look at the evidence. The evidence is clear. We are citizens of this country. Then access to healthcare should be a right? It shouldn't be a privilege. The ability to feel safe in one's neighborhood should be a right, not a privilege. So it becomes a structural issue. It relates to legacies, but continuing manifestations of white supremacy in a way that makes Black people vulnerable. And then, we're in late capitalism. And we can't underestimate the degree to which Black people are working low-end, menial, low-paying jobs. and somehow are deemed essential.
Mm-hmm.
So they are essential because white people need us to be essential. We are essential in the same way that slave hands were essential. And
Mm-hmm.
so on some level, Black people can't even social distance. And you can't social distance in a way that is meaningful when you have to ride a bus to get to work.
Mm-hmm.
You can't social distance when you're living in overcrowded situations because guess what? You don't have the wealth. You don't have the education. You don't have the kinds of upward mobility that allow you to protect yourself and your family. So I say all of that to say social determinants of health, access to health care, other kinds of phenomenon that relate to the systemic and structural disadvantages that Black people face because their lives are too bad.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. This is why I had to talk to you, man. Yeah, I mean, I think your point is incredible. Let me ask you this. So you talked about, disproportionality in Navajo and in people of African ancestry being killed by this pandemic. What advice would you have about trying to redress these disparities and to protect Black and Brown health?
Well, that's a complicated question. And to be honest with you, Dr. Woods, I've been thinking more and more about what the impact of all of our research is, what the impact of all of the knowledge we've created and activism we've created. And the truth is, there's not really one simple way to protect Black health. And a part of what happens is we can make progress on one front, and then we seem to regress on another front.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about it overall, I think we definitely need to specify the causes better. We need to look at individual health outcomes and not see them as individual choices, but see them as a function of constrained choices. We need to make social determinants of health operative. We need to think carefully about racism as a pathogen that makes people sick. So I think we need to do the kinds of work we do, specify it a lot better, and tell folks, if you are obese, if you are infected, these are generally not individual level choices. This is where you live. This is how much money you have. This is whether you got an inheritance. Those are the things that predict whether you live or die. We also need to do a better job of connecting to the work you do, and work others do on housing and space, right? So part of what has happened is we recognize that there's these hot spots. The burden of disease is never equally distributed. Black people get sicker and die younger. And a part of why that is facilitated is the spatial concentration of Black people. Putting them in places where they're exposed to toxins, where their housing values don't grow at the same level, where they're going to be restricted from access to supermarkets, food deserts. So we need to think more carefully about space and how housing and space and inequality built in the built environment, I think, contributes to this. So we could redress those kinds of issues. I think those are important. We need to access, and we need to make sure that access to healthcare is uniform. But we also need to make sure that access to high quality healthcare is uniform. Now, this is one of those things where it sounds easy to do. But the truth is, Black people are 3 times more likely to have limbs amputated than medical. So if we're talking about access to high quality healthcare, we really do need to pin this on doctors. And we need to pin this on the medical profession in a very particular kind of way. There was a study published some time ago that looked at Medicare and Medicaid data and procedures that Black people and white people got. And there were 4 procedures that Black people were more likely to get. And you think, oh my gosh, that sounds like good quality health care. So I talk about a couple of the procedures. One was excisional debridement. Excisional debridement. And what that is removing dead tissue. So that was not a win for Black people to get to a point where your tissue is dead and it has to be surgically removed. Bilateral auriectomy. I had to look that up. I didn't know what that was. That's removal of the testicle. So Black men are more likely to have to deal with excisional debridement, more likely to do bilateral auriectomy, and a couple other procedures that suggest that when they get healthcare, they're not even getting good quality healthcare. And then I think we need to talk carefully about the vulnerability that white supremacy creates. And the only way to talk carefully about that is to make it plain and then undo it. So if we're going to undo those vulnerabilities, if we're going to make Black people less vulnerable, then we've got to talk about white supremacy. We've got to talk about education. It may seem strange to say, addressing a health problem is about education, but it is. When you have the wherewithal to make informed decisions and you can communicate with your doctor in a very kind of way about your own health, you can advocate for yourself. Mm-hmm. So we need to think about education because education protects us from many low-income, menial jobs. Education gives us access to healthcare too, right? Because when we get a job in our country, we pair that with health insurance, right? Mm-hmm. We make health insurance and jobs go together. So we need to think about education. We need to think about incarceration. One pandemic we don't talk enough about related to COVID is what's happening inside prisons now. Hepatitis B, HIV, smoking, and all kinds of poor health behaviors because we put people in inhumane situations and we put them there mainly because of the color of their skin. Mm-hmm. And we just extended the reach of slavery, right? We're in slavery's wake, right? And slavery's wake is still being felt, right? You can see the waves of slavery, right, rolling across, and the prison industrial complex today is just an extension of slavery. So we need to think carefully about that because that has implications for health. And you might say, well, how would that have implications for health outside of the community? Well, if you take away Black men disproportionately, and now increasingly Black women from communities, those communities can't thrive. Those communities can't bring in grocery stores. Those communities can't advocate for sidewalks. Those communities can't build organizations that would advocate to make their spaces better. And then the other axis is wealth, right? So we have to think carefully about what it means to have Black people be successful right now, but that success be translated a generation later. And if we can't have wealth building in the Black community, then we can't have Black-owned businesses. Maybe Black-owned businesses that sell us products that are not deep fried. Right? Maybe if we have access to wealth, maybe we have banks, so we don't have to be disproportionately charged exorbitant interest rates to purchase a product that we would like to have. If we have access, you know what? Maybe historically Black colleges become the space where we can protect our physical health and mental health. And, we need to also make mental health a part of this conversation because COVID's largest impact will be mental health. Because now we're in this moment when we have no distraction. And I think Black people are going to realize now that our lives might never matter. Ever. Because when a Black man says he can't breathe in 2020, I recall that might have been something a Black man said before in 2014. So this is not new. This is just an extension. So I think Black folk are now processing the degree to which things have not changed. And, I recognize many people want to point to Obama and maybe say he helped redress health issues with the Affordable Health Care Act. But honestly, it was implemented poorly and it has not reached everyone it should have. And in some ways, when it comes back to this issue of mental health, we need to be really careful about these hope dealers like Obama, right? They would like to sell you that poison and have you believe that the world is colorblind. And in this moment, we come back to realize the color of our skin means so much to everybody. We are still dealing with the problem of the color line that Du Bois talked about. And ultimately, we have evidence now, irrefutable evidence, that our lives don't matter. And yet we still get pushed on this level to think about hope and other kinds of things, to be optimistic. So I think this is a moment when we redress these things for Black people to think really carefully about how much progress they're going to make and to protect their own mental health and reach out to each other and support each other in this moment. Because when we're talking about changing these systemic things, these are things that don't happen in a lifetime. These are not things that are going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years. We're talking about reorienting the system. We're talking about tearing the system down and rebuilding it in a way that is more equitable. there. So we can address these issues, but these are issues that require a certain reorganization of society. And to be honest with you, at this moment in time, I am not optimistic. I am not someone who gets the product from some hope dealer. I'm someone who is disinclined to believe things are going to change. So we might begin to redress them. More than likely, we're just going to address them. We're going to make them more visible. But will we be able to make them go away? Will we be able to reduce health disparities? I don't know. I don't know, Dr. Woods. It seems as though we are content with watching Black people live, sick, and die young.
Man, Dr. Brown, you gave us all the things to think about. I appreciate you. So before we go, is there anything else that I didn't ask that you would like to just elucidate on?
Yeah, it turned out in this moment, I'm thinking about the degree to which there's many different groups of people whose lives are not fulfilled, whose life chances are not what they should be, whose lifestyles are not what they should be. And these many different groups of people are in this position because of life's. So I'm wondering, in this moment when there's no NBA, there might not be an NFL, the economy seems to be teetering on the brink of recession yet again, when Donald Trump is in office and he's made it his purpose to denigrate those people who have made this country great by talking about making the country great again. I'm wondering why we might see so few interracial coalitions. Are we going to band together? Is this the moment when folks are going to come together to think carefully about how we battle white supremacy? The United States is no longer a white country. So I'm waiting for this coalition building with my American Indian brothers and sisters, because the settler colonial project to destroy them is almost done. And I'm willing to reach out a hand. And I think my brown brothers and sisters, they need a hand too. And COVID, we kind of forgot where COVID started. Asian Americans were the new Black people for a minute. So maybe there's some coalition building that should happen here, and I'm hoping that it can happen. And I'm not so optimistic, in part because I think there is something very particular about anti-Black, and they can't be equated with anything else. Anti-Blackness is built into the fact that there was never a high culture for Black people. There was never a high point for Black people. I'm sorry. Our high point was when we were 3/5 of a person. But since that point, we have not returned to a space where we are anything more than living in the wake of slavery. And so, given the nature of anti-Blackness, maybe we can't build these coalitions. But I'm hopeful in this moment that with all the distractions removed, all the victims of white supremacy will find some value in supporting the Black cause, and in turn having their own cause.
Awesome. Doc, I appreciate your time.
Hey, yeah, anytime, and you keep doing what you do, because you are validating to so many of us who are on the front lines of trying to make racial change happen, and make social justice happen. And we appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Doc. Okay.
All right, take care.
Yep. I'm here with Dr. Terah Venzant Chambers. She's a professor and associate dean at Michigan State University in the College of Education. Dr. Venzant Chambers, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me today.
Of course.
First, let me ask you how you're coping with the dual pandemics of COVID and racism personally.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? It's just a lot. It's a lot going on at one time. It's a lot thinking about how you protect your children in times like these. It's just, there's just a whole lot going on, and then trying to go to work like everything is normal when nothing is normal. So yeah, it's tough. I appreciate you naming it, right? It's a struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. I really wanted to talk with you, with your expertise in education. Could you talk a little bit about schools being sites of inequity broadly?
Yeah, there are so many ways to come at that question, historically and economically, and, just so many different ways that inequities come into play. Do you want to give me more where you want to go? with inequities?
I'm leading it to you. I thought
Leading it to
about,
me.
yeah, because you're the expert on this, right? And from my perspective, why education is so significant is it leads to opportunity. And without access to opportunities, you start to see some of the broad-based disparities that we're talking about and seeing as in the society, how some communities are over-policed with access to limited facilities and resources. And I think that has a lot to do with schools, with educations in general, with inequities in achievement gaps, inequities in a whole host of things. So whatever you want to talk about is good. There's no right or wrong answer. You the lady.
Yeah, I got you. All right. Well, one of the things that I think about is, I appreciate the attention that is placed on some of the things that are happening right now. In our district here, we have gotten some positive attention for defunding our involvement with the local police station and a commitment to hiring more Black teachers. And I think that those are important actions. But what's difficult sometimes to communicate is that these are important steps, but they also are just kind of like the tip of a big iceberg of how we need to deal with larger systemic kinds of issues. So, people will say, like, why is it important to hire Black teachers? And that's such a loaded question because there is so much to that. One of the underlying questions, or one of the underlying assumptions that I kind of get I bristle about is with the question call for more Black teachers is like because they're so hard to find, or there's not a pipeline, or like these kind of like an assumption that we don't exist, when historically we know that one of the consequences of the Brown decision was the wholesale firing of Black teachers almost overnight. We had generations of Black teachers. Like there was not a higher calling than to be a preacher or a teacher, right? Like that's, historically what our community kind of held up as examples of excellence. Like that's what we did with our education was we became teachers. And so we don't talk about it, but the Brown decision said we can no longer send students to segregated schools, fine, but it didn't say anything about teachers. And the white community was not going to put up with their children being educated by Black teachers. And so overnight, we lost almost a generation of Black teachers. It's a legacy that we are still recovering from. So when we talk today about the lack of Black teachers, I'm always very clear to say, well, there's some historical responsibility that we have to understand what is going on right now. And then you pair that with overwhelming research that suggests that so many positive benefits are associated with having a Black teacher, not just for Black children, although certainly for them, but for all children, to see Black teachers as an authority figure, that we can be in these roles, that we can be all kinds of things in schools. We can be a counselor, we can be a principal, and we can also be the janitor. Like these are all aspects of community that we can be part of, right? And so that's one piece of it. There is another piece about school funding, right? And I think there are communities that have such limited resources. We have not done a good job of investing in schools. We have not followed through on the commitments that we really have for our children. And you can see it. And so I can understand why, there is a move to put a school, a police officer in a school building. It's a tangible reaction. It's something that's visible. It calms communities down. People feel safe because some people feel safe because there's a police officer in the school, but it doesn't do anything really. There's no real research that documents that having school, like a police officer in a school, makes a place any more safe, right? The very, I would say the research is mixed on that, or lies in the way of saying like that the more research, that it doesn't necessarily lead to people feeling like there's a safe climate having a police officer in the schools. And so, but I understand why people do it, because the calls from Black Lives Matter at school, and just Black Lives Matter in general, this whole movement that's been going on for a long time, but recently with Black Lives Matter, one of the platforms is defunding police. And that is not about, I think one of the misconceptions is that people are saying that we don't want to invest any money at all in police. And that's just not what it's calling for. It's saying that those dollars that we're putting into schools are better invested in a whole host of other ways aside from putting a police officer there. It's a commitment to mental health and counseling services and creating a culture and community where students feel safe, about investing in children's restorative practices and not treating kids as criminals, right? And having a police officer in a school just doesn't have anything, there's nothing positive about that for kids to see. So anyway, I'm kind of going off on a whole host of different ways here, but there are just so many things that, when I think about inequities, right? Like there are just so many ways that we need to come at this, right? Financially is one of them, but I appreciate the attention that's being placed on schools right now as sites to really ameliorate some of the problems that we're facing systemically.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Excellent. That's why I wanted to have you talk, man. You're over here killing it. One of the things I think is important too is, and just kind of elaborate on a part of the conversation you brought up, talk a little bit about school to prison pipelines and the research that's been done by education scholars in that regard.
I think this came about as part of a larger response to safety in the 90s,
Mm-hmm.
zero tolerance, really kind of moving in that direction of, what does safety mean? Moving towards suspensions as a response. And actually, the American Federation of Teachers put out a statement, I guess, a couple of years ago, saying that they were wrong, that their support of zero tolerance really didn't lead to safer schools, didn't really have any kind of impact on, on school climate in a positive way that they thought. If anything, when you lay a policy like zero tolerance on a system that is already racially biased, right, is already racist, what it does is it puts at greater risk kids like ours. Black children are disproportionately affected by every stage in the process. We're treating children like criminals, and in some ways forgetting that they are kids, and we have a responsibility in education to teach them and taking them out of class, right, doing a suspension or an expulsion doesn't teach them anything. At best, it doesn't teach them anything. At worst, it puts them at greater risk of encounters with the police that lead to, like all kinds of negative outcomes further on down the line. That's what the pipeline's talking about, is the greater propensity for all kinds of interactions with police in negative ways. There's just that don't have to exist, and certainly schools don't have to be perpetuators of.
Yeah. Absolutely. Talk a little bit about the relationship between funding and achievement, right? I mean, that's something that to me is glaring when you start thinking about disparities in resources and access to funding from one district to another, from one neighborhood to another.
Yeah, I think that there are some like pervasive contemporary issues that play into it, but also historical ones. And so I can use an example here in Michigan. We don't really know what the financial impact will be. We get projections and we, everybody's kind of looking to see, but we know it's going to be dire. Like we're talking about in some cases $1,000 reduction in per pupil expenditures per kid.
Wow.
Like that could extrapolate into millions of dollars.
Yeah. Wow.
And so right there, that has, it can radically impact what we're able to do in schools. And some districts that have kind of a money in the bank, for lack of a better way to say it, can compensate for that, maybe not long term, but certainly in the short term, can be better able to navigate that because they have more resources, where other districts do not have a safety net at all. So there is no other choice but firing teachers, letting teachers go, and disinvesting in critical resources that schools really, counselors, professional development opportunities, all kinds of things that nobody wants to cut. Right. I was talking with someone who was talking critically of their district because they had let go a number of teachers this week. And, I understand their concern, but no one's letting teachers go because they want to. This is not something people are excited about. There is literally no other choice. Right. So that's the contemporary piece of it. But then there's a historical legacy too of, some districts have never, have historically and pervasively been underfunded, have been, there's a history of disinvestment going back into the 40s and 50s, and never having recovered from that, and never received the resources that they were due from that. And then you layer on top of this historical legacy what's happening now in school. It's just impossible. We're asking schools which should be on the front lines of helping kids and families respond to what's happening with COVID-19, but instead we're taking already cash-strapped districts, taking away the resources that they really critically need, and when we really should be giving them more money. Because when these kids come back in the fall, all of the mental health concerns, all of the safety issues, all of these things come with them, and we are going to have fewer resources to help them instead of more, and that makes me really concerned.
Yeah, I could see why, for sure. And this is not just going to be Michigan. This is going to
I
be nationwide.
mean,
right.
Michigan is particularly hard because our investment financially in schools has been pretty terrible. Like we rank at the bottom in terms of financial investment in schools. So we are already in a negative place and looking at a situation of being even more negatively impacted. But certainly no state is going to recover from this positively. There aren't any school districts anywhere that are saying like, you know what, I feel really good about what's going to happen to our financial situation in the fall. And that should not be what they think. It's like there should be a federal response of saying like, let's make sure that our healthcare infrastructure and our schools are the most well prepared. And we're seeing that that's the opposite, right? Schools are not, if hospitals don't have the protection, the equipment that they need, schools certainly don't. So, I'm not exactly sure where this is going to lead, but I'm concerned about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I see why. Well, I guess before we shut it down and stop for a little bit, is there something else that you want to have a conversation about or talk a little bit about, something that you'd like to elucidate on about educational inequities in this current situation?
Yeah, I think when we are talking about kids, especially Black kids, Black and brown kids, I think there is we think about kids who live in the cities and who live in urban areas. And that's true. I mean, that's fair and true, and that exists, and that's important. And I certainly am a scholar who cares about urban education, and I have those conversations. But there is also a population of kids, Black kids and brown kids, who are in suburban and rural schools. And those are the children that sometimes I'm even more concerned about. They're not on our radar. And so when we think about the resources that kids need everywhere, I'm thinking about those kids who are the only Black kid in their class or one of a few, or, you and I both went to schools that were like that, right? We know what the consequences of that can be. And that's not just in a COVID-19 era or just a racism era, with this double pandemic that's going on. But it's important for us to keep on the radar that there are Black kids in all schools, and all of them need our resources and attention. So, it's something that I care about.
It's a great point. I think sometimes for Black parents, highly resourced and racially and socioeconomically diverse communities or educational spaces are rare. So we have to make tough choices sometimes, right?
Yeah, it's an impossible choice.
Right. Do they go to prom or do they get a good education? Right. Socially isolated. Right.
It's true. We had a situation here in mid-Michigan where a local superintendent of a white, relatively affluent district made comments on social media that he, had George Floyd done these certain things, this wouldn't have happened to him, right? If he had been a good citizen, he would have ended up in the situation where he was in, right? So we don't sit with that for a second. And rightfully, the community raised up and was like, no, this is not okay. He is no longer superintendent. All of these things happen, but and that was all the right thing to do. But what happened in the aftermath of that was a 7-hour school board meeting where family after family, Black family after Black family, spoke about the kind, like, that this wasn't an isolated incident of a racist superintendent. It was a pattern of behavior throughout the district, right? Of Black children being targeted, Black children being unfairly treated, about the systemic nature of racism. And that was heartbreaking to listen to, but it was also a really painful and important reminder that, like that our children are not safe in these school environments either. Like the educational quality may be high according to whatever metric, and whether we agree with those metrics or not, but it is a dangerous game of roulette that we play every day. Do we send our children to schools that are under-resourced, right? And have to play the catch-up game and supplement and, do all of these things? Do we send them to schools that are more financially resourced and then deal with the racism that our kids are going to experience there and have to be fighting every day, supporting our kids on that side? It is just a profound unfairness that if you are Black in this country, you cannot find a school that is both excellent and like affirming, racially affirming for your children. They exist in pockets and bubbles and isolated places. Please, people, give me the list of these schools and we will all move there. But they, it is a unicorn. It is a myth. It is something that we're all fighting for, but I've yet to see it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so very much for taking the time out of your day to talk with me. I really appreciate you.
Of course, Dr. Woods. It's been good spending some time with you.
All right. With me is Dr. Sharita Jacobs-Thompson. She is an assistant professor at Prince George's Community College and runs a really incredible program that's a partnership with University of the District of Columbia and the DC Metro Police Department, and does a course basically on the history of policing. So first, Dr. Jacobs-Thompson, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I thought about you immediately when this opportunity came to me. Let me first get started by having you talk a little bit about the class, a little bit about the course that you run, and a little bit about the history of policing in relationship to the Black community.
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. So in 2017, I was asked to come on board and co-teach and co-facilitate a course, which we eventually titled The History of Policing in African American Communities. The program runs through the University District of Columbia. So both me and my teaching partner, Bernard Demchuk, are listed as adjunct professors there to facilitate the program for the DC Metropolitan Police Department. We worked with the DC Metropolitan Police Department's Academy to put together a curriculum for the program with the idea of trying to help the officers understand how we got to this moment. In other words, how do we get to the point where the Black community is distrusting of police, right? So at the end of the day, that's what we wanted them to have, an understanding of like the foundational issues that play into this moment that we are in. And we also use the National Museum of African American History and Culture as a part of this training, a critical part of this training. But we didn't want to just take them to the museum and spend all day there trying to discuss some of these issues. So what we ended up doing is setting up classroom time. And so our first 3.5 hours of the day is actually spent in class discussing some of these issues, going through that history, and then going to the museum and pairing particular exhibits that emphasize those conversations, parts of those conversations that we had in class. So for instance, we do 2 parts. My teaching partner, Bernard Demchuk, starts. And a good part of the program that I really was excited about is that he actually does the African American history in Washington, DC. And so it is very interesting to see police officers who have policed particular communities in the city for 15, 20 years and not really know the history of those communities. U Street and its history as Black Broadway, had no idea about the history of the communities that they spent 15 to 20 years of their career in, right? So my partner, Bernard Demchuk, goes from the colonial period through the Civil War, looking at the history of African Americans and their contributions to the building of the city, our nation's capital. Particularly also make sure to mention things like the rise of what some would call the early policing of Black bodies in terms of slave patrols. Now, of course, there's some debate as to, was this the beginning of police departments? But certainly, even if it wasn't the beginnings of what we think of in terms of contemporary policing, it was the policing of Black bodies, right? So a growing body of literature starting to talk about that. So he makes that connection for them, particularly during the antebellum period, the late colonial, early antebellum period. And then around the Civil War, he really emphasizes the African American experience during the Civil War, particularly Black soldiers who are fighting with the United States colored troops, emphasizing their role in the war. So, which is really good. And a lot of officers, don't know much about that. And especially considering we have the African American Civil War Museum right here. And when we take our recruits out, that's actually someplace we go to visit the monument that is right across the street from the museum that really emphasizes the role of African American, particularly men, in the war. So that's the first part of the class. And then I take over during Reconstruction, and then I start with Black codes, looking at the formation of these laws that are proliferating throughout the former Confederacy in the aftermath of the Civil War, talking about their impact and even pointing out particular laws and emphasizing particular laws. For instance, I look at one in Maryland where you see former planters who are using the apprenticeship system in order to pilfer the labor of children. So in other words, they're taking these children to the orphan court as soon as emancipation is declared in Maryland in November of 1864, and they're having those children apprenticed to them until they're adults, right? So we talk about the impact of all of that. And then we move forward to more contemporary issues, particularly the convict lease system that comes out of these very petty laws, where you see African Americans being arrested for small infractions and put into, or given to others, or that's what I'm looking for. So their labor is leased out, whether it be to planters or to industries. And so we talk about the emergence of this convict lease system that's coming about. But then we also talk about contemporary issues, like the whole idea of crack versus powder cocaine, right? So one of my questions is to them, just to see their own knowledge base about this issue is, I just say, well, what is this crack versus powder cocaine stuff about, right? And so then we have, the things that they come up with, right? Some of them are very knowledgeable about the disparities in sentencing, et cetera, with all of that. And some of them, are not so knowledgeable. So it's interesting to engage in those conversations. So that's what we do. We go through and we use critical race theory in order to ground us in these conversations. My partner lets them know from the beginning that this is a conversation from the African American perspective. He talks about George Washington, but he says, this is not about him. This is about his chef Hercules. We're going to look at it from his perspective, right? And so, so that's what we do in the classroom. Some interesting conversations, because we don't lecture to them. We actually engage in conversations. One of the questions that I ask during my time is, what was your first experience with a police officer, right? And the answers that I solicit in that portion of the class have amazed me, how open people have been. I've had middle-aged African-American men, break down in tears, recalling that they wanted to become a police officer because of a terrible experience they had, typically as children or teenagers, with a police officer. Whether it was one of my officers who moved to North Carolina and had a gun put to his head because an officer claimed that he had stolen what turned out to be one of his baseball teammates' bicycles, right? Or whether we're talking about the officer from California who recalls leaving a party and not knowing what was going on when the police surrounded him and beat him so bad and had him chained to the floor with broken ribs as a teenager. So, and I'm talking about real tears, where these are people who had to be consoled, recalling those experiences, right? And many of them use those experiences to discuss why they wanted to become police officers themselves and make sure that that didn't happen to anybody else. So those are some amazing conversations that we have. And, I ask also general questions about, where do you think we are as a city in return, in terms of our relationship with the African American community. And that also solicits a lot of conversations about, community policing, new recruits, and, their lack of social skills, for example, right? How do we expect them to do community policing when, so all those debates kind of come up in class too. And it also gives them a platform to speak to one another, right? I kind of remove myself as a facilitator and allow, veterans to speak to new recruits or newly hired people on the force and have those conversations. Because what we found, we polled them in the beginning to see what district they come from or what district they police and where they come from. And what we ultimately found that officers who were on the force for more than 15 years, large contingency of them were from Washington, D.C. But if you went 10 years or less, most of them were from other places, right? So that's why it became, even more critically important for us to do the DC part of the program, because so many of our newer officers are not from Washington, D.C., not even just from Washington, D.C., even from the country. We have a lot of police officers that are coming from other countries. So that is a very critical part of our training. And as a matter of fact, when we do the training for our recruits, they actually get 2 days. So we do 1 day doing exactly what I described to you, doing the classroom time and the museum time. But another day is a walking tour of a historically Black neighborhood, where we talk about the history of that particular neighborhood, the Black history of that particular neighborhood. So they get 2 days. So after we spend our classroom time, we walk up about 2 blocks to the museum, and we start to go through a guided tour of the bottom half of the museum, which they call the history galleries. And we start to try to showcase particular parts of that museum that align with some of the discussions that we've had that morning. And so we spend the rest of the day there. We have lunch there. We talk about African-American foodways and culture during our lunchtime. And then after that, we visit the top half of the museum, where there are also exhibits that emphasize some of the issues that we have discussed that morning. So that's what a typical 10-hour day. We do a debrief, although the police department is collecting statistics on the training, which we have yet to get back, but anecdotal information or anecdotal feedback has given us some insight about how people are receiving the training. And overwhelmingly, it's been positive. We've had some officers who have gone through the museum, and you think maybe they're disinterested, but then when you pull them aside and have a conversation with them, we had one young woman who said, I can't do this. My family has sat down and had, I'm from the deep South, and my family sat down and I've listened to my grandmother have these conversations. I can't, right? So she really was emotional during the tour, because she was recalling those kitchen table conversations with her grandmother about lynchings, about, the horrors of white supremacy that she had endured as a young person. So, the reactions, one thing is these folks are human and they've had their own experiences, and they bring those experiences to the conversation. So it's been very rewarding for me to be able to take part in all of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important. The course sounds incredible, and it's important now because we're talking about reforming police departments. And it sounds like what your program is already doing is trying to humanize the people who are being policed by these officers, right? As a way of kind of providing the historical context. Having done some of this work to actively get involved in the community and to engage in policing, sensitivity training and the like, historical training, if you will. What are some other maybe reforms or interventions that you'd like to see, given what we've experienced over the past several weeks in the country in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, interestingly enough, I do like the fact that along with our program, our program is not seen as the solution for everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
MPD does implicit bias and other sorts of de-escalation training like other police departments around, and have been doing it for some time.
Mm-hmm.
So I really applaud them for trying to be on the forefront of making these changes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, we hear different cries from different groups for deeper reforms, and even the idea of abolishing police departments and prisons, right? This whole idea of defund police departments has taken hold across the country, and of course here in Washington, D.C. as well. But I think sometimes you have to kind of break that down, because, I think everybody got really hysterical when they first started talking about defund police, when many people who were making that call were not asking that police no longer exist, but that we take some of the funding from the police department and put them into services that
Mm-hmm.
will stifle the need to even have police intervene. And ironically, when I'm having conversations with police officers in the classroom, you would be surprised at how many of them say we do things that we should not be doing. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We are not, they talk about the calls that parents make to them because they want them to come into their household and get their children to go to school. Right. They talk about, the calls to go get a homeless person off the street in the middle of the winter. Right. And how, one officer said, we act like these people don't know how to navigate things. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that is detrimental when we as police officers have to intervene, take them off of the streets. They can't take all of the things with them. And so they have nothing to come back to. So that's devastating, right?
Mm-hmm.
But because of legislation that's been passed in the city, that is a part of their job. So I think people would be surprised, at least here in Washington, D.C., to hear that some police officers have echoed the same things, that there needs to be more resources placed in so they don't have to intervene in certain situations that they are ill-equipped to handle.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is more of a universal sentiment than people may think. And I think that is a part of it that I think is necessary too. I'm not going to argue from taking that money from police departments or where you get it from. I just think that those services are necessary to put people in place that know and have been thoroughly trained as to how to deal with these issues. Of course, mental health is a serious issue, and it's a serious issue that we are really now starting to tackle and be more serious about in the African American community in ways that I have not seen in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is a good thing, to put resources in places so hopefully we can prevent people from committing the sort of crime where they're locked up for extended periods of time. If we can stop that before they get to that point, whether that's
Mm-hmm.
delivering better housing, food programs, mental health services, education, I'm all for that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm absolutely all for putting more money and resources in those places to try to stop that from happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
To stop that from happening in various communities where there are needs.
Sure. Could you speak a little bit about maybe the history of that kind of distrust that you mentioned earlier between the police and the broader Black community?
Well, of course, that history goes back because, one of the examples I give the police officers, of course, we know laws that are coming about as they're associated with the convict lease system,
Mm-hmm.
loitering. So my example is, if you are walking down the street, and I use, Slavery by Another Name, the text,
Mm-hmm.
and draw examples from that where people are being arrested because they can't prove that they are gainfully employed or they have some place to stay.
Mm-hmm.
I said, so can you imagine if you're in a community and you hear this is going on because people have just disappeared, right? And you're walking down the street and you see a law enforcement officer. I said, what is going to be your reaction? And most of them say, we're going to run, right?
Mm-hmm.
One officer said, pew, right? I'm going in the opposite direction because I don't know if I'm going to have what I need at that moment to be able to satisfy that officer, right? So we really start to dig deeper into that conversation when we talk about the laws that are being passed in the aftermath of the Civil War that leads to untold numbers of African Americans who are ending up in prisons as a function of violating, right? Really what it looks like initially are these labor laws.
Mm-hmm.
You're not gainfully employed, we'll change that, right? So I start kind of there looking at some of these particularly former Confederate states that are passing these laws and the ramifications they have on African Americans and the distrust that is built up by those communities when you have police officers who are arresting you for petty crimes or even inventing crimes that you have committed in order to get you into a prison system to be able to profit from your labor.
Mm-hmm.
And we make some, very concrete connections to what we see now, right? All of these industries that are using prison labor to produce their goods, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of these industries that got caught a few years ago, Victoria's Secrets and the like, for having prisoners produce their goods for very little money for the prisoner, if anything, right? So that, I kind of track that more through the use of African Americans' labor or the stealing really of their labor.
Sure. You referenced earlier the crack versus powder cocaine disparity in sentencing. And I just wanted to maybe see if you could just elaborate a little bit about it. I think I understand what you're talking about. For those who don't, could you just talk a little bit more about it? It'd be great.
Okay, so we have legislation that comes about. Of course, Clinton gets the brunt of the legislation that was put forth where people were getting sentenced or receiving longer sentences for being caught with a certain amount of crack cocaine opposed to powdered cocaine. That is one thing that Barack Obama's administration tried to deal with before the end of his administration. So it ended up being a disparity in sentencing where we see a lot more Black and brown people who are in our prisons as a function of nonviolent drug offenses.
Mm-hmm.
And that's still something that we are still contending with today, at a time when marijuana has been legalized through, many states in our country. We still have brown and Black men who are in prison for what is now legal in many places, right? So when we start to deal with these policies and we start to look at race, we have to be very honest about how those policies have impacted various groups over others. I have police officers tell me all the time, well, we know what they're doing up at Georgetown, but we can't go up there. But they can go over to Ward 8 and lock up everybody on the street corners. And the argument is because they're visible. Usually the dealing in crack cocaine was on the street corners, whereas the dealing of the powder cocaine was on Capitol Hill or on Wall Street, right? So kind of in the shadows, if you will.
Yeah. And the different relationship between how certain communities are policed versus others, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, before we get going, is there anything that I did not ask that you'd like to just kind of talk about or elaborate on?
No, I mean, I think that, we're in a critical moment. I would love to see what comes of this. I am certainly proud of the people who are in the streets demanding that we reform our police departments, what those reforms will look like. I mean, I hope that we continue to have multiple voices at the table as these reforms go through, because we also know that, there are people in these same communities who may want something different than what is being asked by, our wonderful activists who are loud and clear these days, who are, screaming from the hilltops what they want. So, I mean, I hope that all parties are able to sit at the table and come to some real conclusions about how we need to move past these racialized policies that impact particular communities, that have a devastating impact on particular communities. And I hope everybody comes to the table as honest brokers so we can come out of this better than we went into it.
You're hopeful about that?
I don't know. I always talk about that pendulum swing. Sometimes it's so far over there that instead of trying to move it to the middle, we swing it all the way to the other side, and eventually it's going to swing right on back. We know as historians about the backlash, and I always warn that the backlash is going to come. So sit down and have those conversations and force these politicians to make the reforms that you want to see happen. But, have those multiple voices at the table.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me, Dr. Jacobs-Thompson. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thanks. We have with us Dr. Michelle Stevens. She's a full professor of education and leadership at Middle Tennessee State University and a licensed mental health counselor. She's also done extensive research on PTSD and the emotional and psychological trauma that the Black community experiences enduring racism. Dr. Stevens, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. Before we get started, let me first ask how you're doing coping with the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and racism.
How am I doing? So my first answer is I'm tired. Exhausted. Tired is not even the word. I'm exhausted. And, my answer varies depending on who's asking it as well. Because coming from the lens of this has been happening for years and years and years and decades, that's where the tired and exhausted part comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And the other part of that is, it's, I think I'm a little resentful as well. I feel a little
Mm-hmm.
resentful because I'm exhausted because it has happened forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's this reawakening or awakening, not even reawakening. There's an awakening that I think white America is feeling, and so when someone else asks me that,
Mm-hmm.
who this is a new thing, I think my answer is a little different.
Mm-hmm.
And my answer is this has been the same, right? This is the same. So to answer your question, I'm tired, and I'm coping through a lot of different ways. Sometimes I disconnect. I am really focusing on self-care, and
Mm-hmm.
that self-care can mean, disconnecting and, exercising and cooking and playing with my dog and spending time with
Mm-hmm.
family, stuff like that. And then other times I'm allowing myself to feel the way that I feel. I'm giving myself that grace. If I'm angry at that moment, I'm angry. And I'm saying no to stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a long answer to your very short question.
No, it's a great question. I want to start there because the struggle is real right now. How can the Black community, or what advice would you give to the Black community in terms of coping with systemic racism and broader based abuse from the broader population?
Yeah. Um, so I think very similar to what I was talking about with me and how I'm coping. I think we got to cope how we cope, right? When we talk about dealing and coping with the effects, a lot of the stuff that we have endured, part of the symptoms that we're seeing is, those are our coping skills. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about, so you mentioned that I study PTSD and the historical effects, the effects of historical trauma. Um, with PTSD, is post traumatic stress disorder. There are lots of symptoms, and some of the three main symptoms are re-experiencing, where you have like flashbacks and nightmares, emotional numbness, that's avoidance of people and activities and things that remind you of the trauma. And then there's increased arousal, right? And this is something that I think that we have seen, some of the symptoms that we've seen the most in the Black community when it comes to policing. But with increased arousal, this is where you have like problems concentrating, or you're feeling jumpy,
Mm-hmm.
or quote unquote paranoid. So I think what has happened is we have coped through these mechanisms. These have become coping skills, or things that would have protected us from the trauma that we're experiencing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so managing those symptoms would be what I would suggest in terms of coping skills, right? So being able to kind of not accept, but navigate through any kind of re-experiencing that we're having right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of people, I know myself included, um, I'm being re-traumatized, right? With
Mm-hmm.
all of the different instances that are being highlighted on the news, with all my white friends checking in on me to see how I'm doing during these 3 weeks, with all of the, I'm teaching a class right now that's, teaching about anti-racism
Mm-hmm.
and having to endure some of the comments that people who aren't necessarily aware of their privilege,
Mm-hmm.
make. Um, those are all things that lead to me re-experiencing some of that trauma, right? And
Yep.
so, what do I need to do to cope with that? That is taking care of yourself, self-care, knowing when to separate, knowing when to log off, right? And knowing that it is okay to say no. in terms of fixing problems that we haven't necessarily created, right? So then with the emotional numbness, same thing, just being aware of that this is what's happening and not internalizing it like it's our problem, it's our fault. And the same thing with increased arousal. So really managing some of the symptoms that have become protective factors for us. That's how we've protected ourselves, from this stuff.
Yeah, it's a great point. You had mentioned earlier about this kind of awakening or reawakening in the broader white population. And part of the struggle that we're having now is that as white America seems to be, or many people in the white community seem to really be hearing the cries that people of African ancestry have made for a while, Black people now have to experience emotionally folks getting it for what may seem like the first time. And I just wanted to get your comments on that.
Yeah, there's a term that in the mental health community, the psychological community, that is used is gaslighting. And gaslighting is usually associated with someone who would be diagnosed with narcissism, right? And that's a lack of empathy, really having a self-focus, and there's a lot of abuse, emotional and mental abuse associated with someone who would be considered a narcissist. But one of the types of abuse is gaslighting. And so gaslighting is really doing something, causing harm to someone, and then denying that you did it. Making the other person, the person who is being harmed, feel like it's their fault or they're not seeing what they're seeing. I feel like for hundreds of years, the Black community has been gaslighted. And for so long, we have been, like you were saying, crying out and saying, this is what's happening. And we have been made to feel like we were wrong, we were lying, or we were crazy. And so there is this, the awakening part of it is that now it's almost like, okay, we hear you now. And so the gaslighting stopped, but it's so abrupt. It's like, wait, hold on. What does that mean? And so navigating through that, I think that there's like a distrust. I've heard and read a bunch on social media and talking to colleagues, it's sort of like, why now? And what are the benefits to you? And to have this grand awakening. So I think, there's some questions about the intentions. And I also think there might be some resentment. It's really, really good that it sounds like everyone is at the party now. Some of us have been here for a while, and, it's like, I'm going to welcome you to the party, but I'm also mention the fact that you're late.
Yeah. It's a really good point. Just think about so many videos. You're like, why this one? It's a really great point. So in terms of broader kind of mental health implications, one of the struggles, and one of the reasons why I really wanted to have you on to talk about this, one of the struggles that a lot of us feel like when talking about gaslighting and some of these other struggles that Black people are coping with, in the Black community, there has been maybe a stigma around mental health and some of these other really important services. What are some of the mental health implications for just kind of dealing with systemic racism?
Yeah. I think that there are so many different implications when we talk about isolation. So feeling isolated, I've had clients talk about that, not feeling safe to talk about how they're really feeling at work, not being asked how they're feeling, not having what's going on in the news and nationally being not even being acknowledged, right? So that isolation is there. We know that isolation can lead to anxiety and depression. I was also thinking about the implications to suicidal ideation, because we know that there is a very strong connection to suicidal ideation and anxiety, depression, isolation, all of those things, right? And so these are things that are happening more and more because of just not necessarily feeling safe or supported. And that's with everything that's happened, and that's with everything that's happened before, but not right now, not just right now, And so I would say anxiety, increased depression, increased isolation, and not necessarily knowing where to go to cope. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. A good point as well. So we're seeing national protests and we're seeing sustained protests around the country. What advice or suggestions would you give to activists to maintain the energy and the coping that they'll need to continue to be, in the front lines? How do you ask them to sustain these issues and to sustain their momentum?
Yeah. I think self-care, and self-preservation, right? I think in order to have that, the continue to be able to support others, you have to be able to support yourself. I have a friend an activist friend, who, when I know that she is getting involved, I will call her and I will ask her, did you drink water today? And that sounds like such a simple question, and yet it is such a basic way to practice self-care, right? So just making sure to pay attention to what your needs are. We know that if you go on a airplane, they tell you to, if the oxygen mask comes down, put it on yourself first, and then, make sure that everybody else is okay. And that's what we have to do. The other thing is to ask for help and to accept help. If the support is there, take it, especially if the intentions are good from the person. Seeking mental health services, it's very easy. And now there's so much more accessibility across the nation. Different rules and regulations have been, kind of lifted in order for us to do telehealth. You can log in on your phone and have therapy on your phone. So it is so accessible right now that, that is such a benefit when it comes to having someone to objectively listen to you and to support you and to understand you and hear you and believe you. That's really important.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. My wife and I joked a lot and said, we think all Black folks need therapy. Just to be Black in America, to cope with all of the iterations of daily micro and less micro aggressions, just aggressions, right? I think it's a really great point that you bring up in terms of seeking help and needing to be able to vent and to be able to be heard and be understood. Before we finish up, anything else that you want to add just about any of it, self-care, PTSD, whatever, that you just want to add at the end of this?
Well, the only thing that I was thinking of as we were talking about seeking help, mental health services, that's not always an easy thing, right? And so there are lots of sites that you can log on to, and you can basically shop for a therapist. And so I think that that's something that we would share, in order to, and there are several. There are some that, like Psychology Today, that's very broad, and then there are others that are very specific to African Americans. So Black girls therapists and all of those things. So I think that's something that I'd like to provide, just a resource of different places that you can find a therapist, mental health specialist.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a struggle, and I really appreciate you for agreeing to talk with us today. Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you.
It is my pleasure to be speaking with Dr. Glenn Chambers. He is a full professor at Michigan State University and also the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies. He's the author of multiple books, but this most recent one, From the Banana Zones to the Big Easy, talks a little bit about the international migration of people from the West Indies, from the Caribbean into New Orleans. Professor Chambers, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
First, let me get started with How are you dealing with the dual pandemics of racism and COVID?
Yeah, it's thank you for asking. And I say that because I don't think that happens enough. And it's just that people asking how we're doing as human beings, as Black men in particular. That's not something that comes up often. So thank you for asking. The COVID situation, it was kind of one of those things. It just happened, right? And so everyone was forced to react and, shelter in place and all of those things. And so like a lot of people, I've been at home for the past 3 months, lots of Zoom meetings and trying to be productive. My wife is a professional as well. And so she's working. We're parents. And so navigating all of that, like everyone else, it has its challenges, but, in one silver lining is, I have had these past 3 months to really spend with my family and focus on family in ways that I haven't in the past. Right. And so it's like, just as we were sorting to get some rhythm going with COVID, the George Floyd situation happens. And it's not like this is the first time that we've seen Black people fall victim to police brutality and other forms of racial violence. But I think this one sort of hit a little closer to home in that, I'm from Houston, Texas. And although George Floyd, was not a personal friend of mine or anything, I didn't know George Floyd. There are people within my circle from growing up who did know George Floyd. And, I knew who he was because, growing up, we played football against him in high school. And George Floyd was someone who was a well-known athlete, a tight end. And so I guess this one hit a little closer in that sense because of the connections with Black Houston on a larger scale. So I'm dealing with it just like everyone else, as, Black people, unfortunately, have always had to deal with these types of scenarios in the United States of America.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What are your initial thoughts on the protest movement? Do you feel this is a difference or a different position, or do you think this is a flashpoint or something that's different? Because like you said, we have seen this before. We certainly, even the language of "I can't breathe" is not new, right?
Right.
And so literally the exact same language has happened with Eric Gardner and others. Do you think this is different? What are your thoughts just kind of on what you're seeing in the country, the response, the multiracial protest movements?
Part of me is the optimist in me wants to believe that this is something different, that we've sort of turned a corner because of the multiracial dynamics of it. It's not all Black faces that you see protesting. It really is a multiracial group of people fighting for these causes and aligning themselves with issues that have overwhelmingly impacted African Americans, right, in this country. So the optimist in me wants to believe that this is different. The historian in me, right, and the person who grew up, being raised by elders, right, and who's heard these stories from previous generations, is like, we'll see. Not convinced, and so again, the optimist wants me to believe that this is different, but the more pragmatic side of me is like, well, we'll wait and see.
Yeah. Great point. So we've also seen the protests happen internationally. Why do you think that this particular most recent iteration of police brutality has been so embraced on an international level?
I think that's a good question. And it's something that I think about a lot. Part of me is, global Black struggles for freedom have always been, right? If we just go back to the transatlantic slave trade and the fight against that system and that institution, it's always impacted Black people everywhere. And so we see historically slave revolts happening throughout. Haiti is at the center of them, particularly after 1803, right? And people trying to maintain those connections. After emancipation in the U.S., we see people like Frederick Douglass really engaging with Haiti and other spaces. And so we've always thought globally, because our condition is very much connected to capitalism, right? And capitalism is not just a U.S. phenomenon. And so part of me is like, yeah, that's, of course, it's global and it's international. But I think what we're seeing more recently, particularly as we see protests in places like the United Kingdom, in Germany, in France, and some of those spaces, and just as someone who's a trained Caribbeanist, Caribbean people have migrated to all of those spaces, right? Recently into the 21st century. And so it's not uncommon to have someone from the Caribbean who has cousins in New York, has cousins in Toronto, has cousins in the United Kingdom, because their parents and their aunts and uncles, because of the economic conditions, were forced to migrate to all of these different spaces. And so these international connections, it's not just, oh, we're Black. It's no, we're Black and we're family. Like we have roots, we have the same grandparents, right? And so it's close in that sense. And then there's also, you got to go back, there's that history of Garvey, right? And the implications of that movement, Pan-Africanism as a global phenomenon, people from the African continent migrating to all of these different spaces. And within our own countries, we can be much more, for lack of a better word, discriminatory, and where we sort of embrace these national identities and these ethnic identities. But when you get into the context of the United States or the UK or, Paris, France, and these other spaces where people are migrating to, I'd argue those national and those sort of cultural identities that we have in our own communities mean less, right? The only identifier that unites us all is Blackness, right? And police brutality, because of the way these states are designed and the role of the police and how they have been used to control poor people and Black people, that is a condition that unites us. And so when someone in the UK sees the video of George Floyd, right, there are untold cases of those same types of things that have happened over there, right? In France, right, in Germany, and all of these other spaces, Spain, Portugal, Italy, where you've had Black people migrate or immigrate, right, and they're being policed by these various nations because of their Blackness and because of their immigrant or migrant status. Yeah, people can see this and identify with it directly. They could name scenarios where it's happened in their own countries. And when you tie it to global capitalism and all of these other things, the movement becomes much larger. And I think also one thing that we see now, and we've seen really, with the internet and the advent of social media, it's not like the 1920s or the 1930s, where you have to wait for it to come out in the press, or you have to wait to hear it from a traveler or from a sailor or something like that, where you get this information. We all have access to this at the, push of a button, right? On our phones, right? You don't even need a actual computer anymore. And so the way news travels impacts people's awareness. And we can't take away from the fact that we're in the midst of a global pandemic where everything has been shut down. So people are at home, right? All day. Even if you're working from home, a large segment of the population is at home. There's no sports happening, right? There's no new movies coming out, new music coming. The distractions aren't there. And so I think it has provided an opportunity, although in not so great circumstances because of, the virus and how it's killing people disproportionately, people, Black people and people of color. But just having that time to be able to pause and actually see what's happening in the world undistracted, I think that's something that we have not ever really seen in recent history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. You were talking about capitalism and the relationship with capitalism to violence and to marginalization in terms of racism, that they're connected. I wanted to see if you wanted to maybe elaborate a little bit more on that point, right? I mean, I was thinking about some of the research that you've done related to banana plantations and the like in the past, right? I guess, could you elaborate more on the relationship between violence and the way that Black people are continually treated, but have historically been treated in relationship to capitalism, wealth production, and violence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, and more tying into my research, our economic lives, and when I say our, I mean, Black people in general, economic lives have often been tied to corporations, right? Sometimes they're nameless, but often faceless corporations. Whether we're working in a steel mill, right, for meager wages, no benefits, whether we were working on, picking cotton, as, sharecroppers, working on banana plantations owned by United Fruit and all of this, shipyards, wherever you name it, it's often been manual, blue collar type labor in which we've been paid a pittance. And the reach of these corporations has always been global, always only enriched a small segment of the population, which typically does not look like us. Mm-hmm. That dynamic, in terms, I think you were mentioning something about wealth creation or the lack thereof, right? But it always puts us in a situation where we are disserviced or underserved. Mm-hmm. And so I think what we're seeing now is no exception to that, right? As the wealth is concentrated more and more in the hands of a minuscule segment of the population, and most people are sort of forced, particularly talking about Black people and people of color, to take on manual, menial types of jobs with no resources, right, become now, quote unquote, essential workers, mm-hmm. right? And where you're confronted day in and day out by this risk associated with the virus, it just exacerbates all of these other things that have happened, right? I think we have to also look at what it means to say that people have been forced to do manual types of work, right? That means access to education is diminished. Access to healthcare is diminished. Access to decent and fair housing is diminished, right? Being able to protect your children, right, is diminished. And so there's sort of, it's not just, so-and-so has a bad job, or, so-and-so, all of the excuses that are mentioned as to why people can't be successful. Mm-hmm. So many obstacles are put in the way, right? And it all stems from this historical condition that Black people and others have found themselves in, right? And we can go to the plantation, right? We can start there. We can start with industrialization, manufacturing, or whatever, these early 20th century. We could start there. We can talk about it, what's happening today. We can talk about Reaganomics. It doesn't matter, right? But in any of these given situations, we still find Black people in very similar circumstances en masse. There are always exceptions, right? There are always people who are going to be okay, but the majority of us always find ourselves at the bottom. And I think capitalism reinforces that, particularly the way it has been implemented in Western society, which by extension, global society.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate it. Is there any other things you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I just, I will say I do appreciate, and I wish more people would appreciate the international scope of this movement, right? Mm-hmm. Because this is something, we get bombarded by the media, particularly in this country that's very US centered. We don't very often hear about what's happening anywhere else, right? And the information that we do get that's global is very tailored to a particular agenda, a particular point of view. Whether it's the left, right, doesn't really matter. We only get a small segment of the news of what's happening. But Black people are everywhere. And because Black people are everywhere, and we're all living under this system that in most ways is very much anti-Black, the struggles in all of these locales, although they may have, they take on the character of the country, their local realities or what have you, but the underlying cause of it all is still rooted in very much the same system. And it's a system that we have been living with in some form or fashion for 500 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when you talk about the global perspective.
Absolutely.
You're talking about, 1441 with the Portuguese?
Right.
Right.
Exactly. So it's a long time.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
579 years?
Right.
Right. So your point, yeah.
Yeah. And so with that said, though, this is not going to be a quick fix. Mm-hmm. A politician can't just pass some legislation, in 2 weeks, or, a president signs an executive order or something like that, and it goes away. No, it's a longer fight. And this generation is just really, in many ways, continuing that fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, great. I really appreciate you taking your time, Doc. It's been great talking with you.
Yes.
And thanks again for agreeing to participate. Mm-hmm. This is Lewis Woods again. Man, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I certainly learned a lot. While I still have questions, I feel like I had a whole lot more answers after talking with my esteemed friends and colleagues. When Dr. Brown said that the height of Black Lives Mattering might have been when 3/5 of our humanity was inscribed into the Constitution, I was pretty blown away by that argument. When Dr. Venzant Chambers referenced the impossible choice that Black parents and parents of Black children experience, trying to figure out a neighborhood and a community and an educational space for their children that's both racially affirming and well funded, being like a unicorn was really interesting to me. When Dr. Jacobs-Thompson said that even some of the police that she's talked to and communicated with during her history of the police class reference how they too were traumatized as Black people before they were police officers, when they were civilians, and that they were motivated to become police officers essentially to ensure that nobody else went through that. I found that particularly poignant and powerful. When Dr. Stevens said that she's happy that white allies are at the party, but wanted them to understand that they're late and imply that they weren't dressed properly for the party was really interesting for me. And when Dr. Chambers referenced just the sheer scope and magnitude of the international struggle that people of African ancestry have experienced dealing with white supremacy and racism the world over. And when he referenced more than 500 years going back to 1441, when the Portuguese started taking people off of the coast of West Africa, it was really impactful for me. And so at this point, I wanted to interject briefly about my own research and how we get to where people live, right? We understand that zip code is destiny, and that zip code influences your wealth and your life expectancy and health outcomes. It affects your access to quality education, and it affects whether or not your community is over-policed. And there are a lot of contemporary examples of that. I want to speak briefly about racial wealth gaps and home ownership gaps. There's been several studies on racial wealth gaps, but a couple that come to mind. One study referenced how it would take African Americans at current rates of wealth construction. The average Black family would take 228 years to get where the average white family had in terms of wealth in the year 2016. There's another study that talked about how even when Black people are homeowners in predominantly Black neighborhoods with the same amenities that white counterparts had in other neighborhoods, people of African ancestry lost $48,000 plus in home equity just because they lived in a predominantly Black space. Another study talked about how the racial gap between home ownership essentially was larger today than it was in the year 1900. And another study talked a little bit about how people of African ancestry were in a position essentially where their home ownership rate today was lower than it was in the year 1968, when the Fair Housing Act abolished the most racially discriminatory or egregious forms of discrimination in the country. The rate at that point was, the study was done last year, was under 41%, so 40.7 or 9% versus about 73 to 74% for white Americans. And for most Americans, wealth is the middle class Americans, your house is your principal form of wealth. People of African ancestry struggle right now because of a legacy of inequality. I'm thinking specifically about the Federal Housing Administration, which was created in 1934 and substantially decreased the amount of down payment that you would need from about 50% to 20% and expanded the repayment from 5 to 7 years to more than a generation. So it was good for Americans. It gave millions of Americans access to better housing, but it was terrible for people of color because the Federal Housing Administration wrote in their manuals, they referenced the language protection from adverse influences. And adverse influences, they described as people of African ancestry and people who are not white. And their language was inharmonious racial and social elements. And so the Federal Housing Administration incentivized banks to address these policies and to embrace these policies principally because they took out risk. So if you're a bank, you can get the federal government to guarantee 80% of the mortgage, have the homeowner put 20% down, and you can collect 4 to 5% interest for the next 20 years without any risk. It's a win-win, right? And so banks, even if they didn't want to abide by those policies, were incentivized by the federal government to adhere to those policies. Other examples of federal complicity with and really sponsoring and underwriting of with racism and segregation. Homeowner Loan Corporation, which is responsible for and credited with the practice of redlining, basically drawing red lines around communities of color and associating them with being hazardous bank investments. There's a great website called Mapping Inequality that showcases many of the maps. There are hundreds of maps in the archives too in Maryland. Mapping Inequality has many of these examples. Every city with a population over 40,000 in the 1930s and 40s has one of these maps. And the area descriptions, the language is atrocious. The Homeowner Loan Corporation references people of color, people who they think of as hazardous, as infiltrators and as invaders to good white space. And so whenever people of color are in any way in numbers, they are given a red area, right, or a redlining area. Additionally to the FHA and the Homeowner Loan Corporation, the Veterans Administration got involved in this too, especially with the GI Bill after World War II. And essentially, the VA, the Veterans Administration, and the Federal Housing Administration came together and did a joint program where the VA would guarantee 20% and the FHA would insure 80%. And the veteran would walk in with a no down payment home. And because the payments were stretched out for a generation, it was cheaper to own than it was to rent. And so literally the suburbs were underwritten by the federal government. Between the VA and the FHA, they underwrote or insured over $100 billion of suburban mortgages, and less than 2% from the FHA went to non-whites, and less than 1% of the Veterans Administration loans went to non-whites. And these are agencies that essentially picked winners and losers, right? They underwrote where we live. And in addition to underwriting the suburbs with huge amounts of money, right? The average home value in 1945 was $5,500. So $100 billion in that climate would be the equivalent of trillions today. So it's really important to kind of get an idea of how where people lived was not an act of God, but an act of intentional, purposeful policy. And so why I think this is significant is that the suburbs were underwritten by the federal government. And in addition to the suburbs being underwritten by the federal government, by the 1950s, the highway systems, which connected the suburbs back into the city for work and and professional opportunities were also underwritten by the federal government. And many of these highways went straight through Black neighborhoods. And that's true all over the country. I'm thinking about in Nashville in particular, I-40 runs right through Jefferson Street. I-10 ran through parts of New Orleans. You can go down the line where these highways were, often bisected, thriving, vibrant Black communities, destroyed businesses, destroyed residential housing and the like, and made people displaced. So not only were the suburbs underwritten by the federal government, but the highway system was underwritten by the federal government and detrimental to Black and brown communities. Okay, so I found a document in the NAACP papers about real estate agencies. The federal government encouraged individuals to marginalize people of African ancestry with racially restrictive covenants where individuals could say, we're not going to lend, lease, or rent to people who are not white. And the language of those covenants changes, from what region of the country you are. But the basic gist of them all is that non-whites can't live here. And these were in vogue really from the early part, maybe the first decade or so of the 20th century into about the mid-century. They're outlawed technically in May of 1948 in Shelley versus Kramer, but they are underwritten by federal agencies until February of 1950. And so the federal government is implicated. Individual homeowners are also implicated, but so are real estate agents. And I want to give you an example of this. But before I do, I want to tell you a story about it. So my grandparents, both born in Louisiana. My grandmother's from New Orleans. My grandfather was from northern Louisiana near Shreveport. And after the war, they decided to move to New York, where my mother and her siblings were born. And they initially went to Harlem. Then they moved to the Bronx. And they were looking to leave the city and come out to the suburbs into Long Island, where I was born. And when they were talking to real estate agents, my grandmother talked about how she was really frustrated by the process. So my grandmother was what you'd call an octoroon, which is basically a 1/8 Black. Light skin, had first cousin that could pass for white, had an uncle who moved out to California and passed for white. So we technically have white cousins in California, but they were essentially my grandmama's people who in Louisiana were defined as Black. So my grandmother, who's light enough maybe to pass or at least to confuse some folk, talked about how when they drove up to a suburban neighborhood, my granddad drove up and, she opened the door and went straight to the real estate agent. My granddad had to lock the doors manually. Took him about 20 to 30 seconds behind my grandmother. And when the real estate agent saw my grandmother, she assumed that she was my grandfather's real estate agent and not his wife. And so she whispered to him, "Oh, we can never have those people live here." And my grandmother said, "I am those people. That's my husband." Right. And then you could see the real estate agent apparently getting mortified and getting very, very flush and red faced with embarrassment. Right. And so my grandmother told me that story over and over and over again as a kid. And recently I found a document in the NAACP papers, which I plan to write on and publish. But this is the document. And so I wanted to set it up because it really validates what my grandmother had told me my whole life. The realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individual whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values in the neighborhood. And they give this specific example. The latter might be a bootlegger who would cause considerable annoyance to his neighbors, a madam who has a number of call girls on her string, a gangster who wanted a screen for his activities by living in a better neighborhood, this is the kicker, a colored man of means who was giving his children a college education and thought that they were entitled to live among whites. All of those the same: bootlegger, madam, gangster, colored man of means. This was the largest real estate agent policy in the 1940s. It's the National Association of Real Estate Boards. And so when you start thinking about this, the reason why people live where they live is decisions individuals made to band together and to sign racially restrictive covenants, federal agencies like the Federal Housing Administration, the Veterans Administration, the Homeowner Loan Corporation, but also realtors, right? And so it wouldn't be until 1968 where the most overt forms of discrimination in these examples was outlawed. Okay, and let me say one more thing briefly. And I think this is an important piece as well. So when COVID hit and we were all kind of homeschooling with our kids, my fourth grader, who is 10, was watching a civil rights related video and was very frustrated at the fact that the video really just glossed over how badly black people were treated. They were like, okay, black people were treated badly, but we got over it. We're better. And my daughter was like, Dad, why don't they talk about specifics about how black people were marginalized? And so I was talking to her briefly about disfranchisement and, giving her like an elementary school level discussion about lynching and some of the other violence that black people had experienced and endured in the country. And then I told her, I was like, she was like, man, I get frustrated by this sometimes. And I told her, well, it's important to understand that something like reading and writing is new to black people relative to their experience in the country. And she was like, well, what do you mean? So I was like, well, all right, baby, get a pencil and paper. And I didn't have anything else to call it, so I called it racism math, right? But I wanted her to understand the enormity of the situation that she's on, that black people have inherited and black people have endured. And so I had her pull out a piece of paper. I said, 1865 is 13th Amendment, frees black people all over the country. Black people first come here, uninterrupted. Esteban came in the 1560s, but we don't really know where he went when he helped the Spanish explore between Florida and what's now California, that like I-10 corridor. But black people have been in this country uninterrupted since 1619, right? So I said 1619 minus 1619 from 1865. You get the year 246 years. That's how long reading and writing, not owning your body, just basic stuff, was denied black people. Okay, 2020 is this year, minus 1865 from 2020. You get 155 years. So minus 155 from 246, you get 91. That's 91 years it's been legal for black people to be enslaved, longer than black people have been emancipated. Okay, so the break-even point for freedom, you have to add 91 years to the year 2020, and you get the year 2111. And I told my daughter that she'd be 101 years old when black people are as free as they've been denied freedom in this country, right? And then I told her, in a democracy, you can't be free if you can't vote. Black people don't get the right to vote without being interrupted until the year 1965, the Voting Rights Act. So if you subtract 1619 from 1965, you get 346 years. You use 1965 and you add 346 years, you get the year 2311 as a break-even period. And you could make quibbles with this because Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 struck out the pre-clearance component of the Voting Rights Act, right? But just for argument's sake, I wanted my daughter to see the enormity of the situation, right? And then when Dr. Chambers was saying that, reminded me about the Portuguese in 1441 and the enormity of that length. When the Portuguese started taking people of West Africans to places like Cape Coast and Canary Islands, and creating plantations, half a century before Columbus, it's a huge number. It's 579 years. And so if you add 579 years, assuming next year we end racism, right? It's just a gigantic, enormous, profoundly unrealistic assertion. But let's assume for argument's sake that 2021 is the year racism ends. If you were to add 579 years to 2021, you get the year 2600. And when you start thinking about the enormity of the situation that we're in, what I think this moment has exposed is that the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and racism have exposed centuries of inequality, right? And it's going to require lots of time, lots of energy, lots of work to really transform structures, systems, institutions that took centuries to construct to get us to this point. Yeah, and so I just wanted to share some of that with you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well. Thanks for listening.